Gonzaga is eyeballing a sharpshooting guard out of Georgetown in the transfer portal. Could he be the final piece to Mark Few's puzzle in 2024-25?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. We got a great show today. John Calipari out at Kentucky. He has taken the head coaching job at Arkansas. We're going to talk about what that means for Kentucky, for Arkansas, and for Gonzaga and that series that they have scheduled with Kentucky. We're also going to talk about Oumar Ballo entering the transfer portal. Former Gonzaga center has played the last couple of years with Tommy Lloyd at Arizona. He's got 1 year of eligibility left. What does that mean for him? Michael Ajayi declared for the NBA draft. We're going to discuss what that means. But first, leading off today's show, talking about a player in the transfer portal who recently indicated that he has heard from Gonzaga. And we're going to talk about Rowan Brumbaugh. And I'm excited to get into talking about him, who he is, why he might be a good fit. But I want to continue to reiterate this point. When we hear that a player has heard from so-and-so school, the wide variety of what that could mean, I think is important context. Because there is a difference between Mark Few came to my house and met my parents and is trying to convince me desperately to come all the way across the country to play for his team versus Stephen Gentry texted me. And that's not a knock on Gentry by any stretch. I'm just saying there is a massive difference in those kinds of communications. And when players are reporting to Joe Tipton or Tobias Bass or whomever else is reporting these transfer portal conversations, we're losing that context. So when people see that, Michael Ajayi has declared for the NBA draft and then that Gonzaga has contacted a player who's a similar size to him in the portal, we're taking a big leap if we think that those things are remotely connected, because we just don't know. Gonzaga contacting players in the portal is in part because they have an open scholarship and they're trying to fill the final pieces to the puzzle. It's also, potentially hedging their bets. Yes, maybe they do think Michael Ajayi could get drafted. I think it is a possibility. I don't think he's going to go play college basketball anywhere else, and I think it's silly to assume that he would. He committed to Gonzaga for a reason, and he is planning to play basketball at Gonzaga next season. But Gonzaga is going to continue to pursue other players in case they lose somebody, in case somebody decides to transfer, in case somebody decides to go pro, in case somebody you don't know. You don't know what's going to happen. Last year, they lost Caden Perry at the end of the offseason because of a medical injury. Things happen. And the last thing you want to do is do nothing until you need to do something. So Gonzaga having these irons out in the fire doesn't mean anything about the current roster. I was about to say that's the last time I'm going to jump on that soapbox. It's probably not, but I think it is an important reminder about the context for these conversations. Having said that, there's a lot to like about Rowan Brumbaugh and the potential fit in Spokane if Gonzaga is able to convince him to come across the country. He's a 6'4" guard. He's originally from Washington, D.C. He's a 4-star prospect in the 2022 class, ranked number 87th overall at On3. That is using their composite rankings. He redshirted as a freshman at Texas. That's where he initially committed out of high school. Went down to Texas, did not play at all in the 2022-23 season, ended up entering the transfer portal again. That season was kind of chaotic. Chris Beard got fired at midseason. Rodney Terry took over the program, ended up leading them out to the Elite Eight, but then there was a huge amount of roster turnover. That included Brumbaugh departing. He enters the transfer portal in April of 2023, commits to Georgetown 3 days later, going back home. Again, he's from Washington, D.C., so he returned home, playing for a new coach in Ed Cooley, and he got a lot of playing time. He was a significant contributor for this Georgetown team. The expectation was that the Hoyas were going to start kind of that rebuild process from the disaster that was the Patrick Ewing era, but Georgetown was pretty darn bad last year. And so now you have Brumbaugh entering the portal again, presumably looking for a place where he can continue to play and build and grow while also trying to win some more basketball games, because I can't imagine anybody was having fun losing basically every single game they played last year except against DePaul. But in 31 games for Brumbaugh last year, he started 20 of them. He played about 22 minutes a night, averaged a hair over 8 points, 2.2 boards, about 2.5 assists, just about 1 steal per game as well. 42.5% on 2-pointers, so not super efficient inside the arc, but he did knock down 37% of his 3-pointers, and he was taking about 2.5 per game. So not a huge volume, but 37% on 2.5 attempts per game. That's pretty darn good. If you're looking for one standout stat on the basketball reference page that makes you think, okay, that's why Gonzaga is interested here, that's what it's going to be. They need some floor spacing. They need some outside shooting. Having Steel Venters comes in helps. We've talked about Michael Ajayi and the impact he's going to make for Gonzaga next year. He was an efficient 3-point shooter last year, but he's not a super high volume 3-point shooter. So I think for Gonzaga, finding some more 3-point shooting, if they are going to make more additions to this roster, is definitely an avenue they want to go. Brumbaugh is also 79% from the free throw line as well. He likes to drive to the rim. He's also a great catch and shoot shooter. Watch some highlights of him, watch some film. You can really see why he would be a logical fit at Gonzaga. He's crafty. Stylistically, you can see he likes to get out and go. He likes to push the pace. When he catches the rock, he's immediately trying to make a move into an offense like Gonzaga's, which has a little bit more spacing. I think would allow him to thrive even more. And we saw some really nice performances from him last year. He had 19 points and 5 assists against Creighton in early January. He had career high 24 points. 3 of 5 on shooting from 3 in that game. That was against Xavier in early March. He also had 15 points, 4 boards, and 3 assists in a true road game against Notre Dame. So lots of intrigue there. And Gonzaga is very far from the only school that has reached out to Brumbaugh. Michigan, Dusty May, trying to make another big move here. They have reached out. Also Arkansas, Tulane, Villanova, Florida State, Ohio State, Nevada, and Santa Barbara. Not in a complete list necessarily, but the most updated list as of this recording. Arkansas, I believe, was pre-Calipari. We're going to get into the John Calipari of it all a little bit later, but so I don't know if Calipari is necessarily going to be interested in Brumbaugh, but Eric Musselman presumably was interested in Brumbaugh at Arkansas. It's potentially likely that he could be involved in trying to bring him out to USC as well, so that's definitely another school to keep in mind. And Ole Miss, because Ole Miss, Chris Beard was who recruited Brumbaugh initially to come to Texas. Brumbaugh transferred after Coach Beard was let go, perhaps. And Ole Miss and Brumbaugh have not been directly connected, but I would toss that out there as a potential landing spot for Brumbaugh as well. The fit at Gonzaga, again, it just depends on how willing he is to not play huge minutes right away. And the majority of players who are transferring are probably looking for at least the same role that they had at their previous school, if not a bigger role. Most players are not transferring to play less. I think that's probably goes without saying, but it is important context when you're talking about a guy who played 22 minutes a game last year, because there's not 22 minutes per game available at Gonzaga this season with the roster as is currently constructed. Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman are going to play 30-plus minutes a night. They both played 35 minutes per game last year. I think Mark Few probably wants that to come down a little bit, but Ryan Nembhard's about to enter his senior year, and he's never played less than 34 minutes per game. So the odds of him just suddenly playing 27 minutes are it's not going to happen. I mean, that's just not going to be the case. Hickman's probably not going to drop down much either. So you just don't have a lot of room for a 6'4" guard in that backcourt. He'd be the number 3 guard behind Nembhard and Hickman. Now, Brumbaugh fits what Gonzaga would like in a third number 3 guard. He can play the point guard. He can play the 2 guard. He's a good 3-point shooter. He's got some experience, just stylistically watching his tape. He would fit that 3rd guard role very well. It would push Luka Krajinovic to the 4th guard role, which I think would be a little unfortunate for Luka, but it gives Gonzaga added depth. All of this makes perfect sense for Gonzaga, but it is hard to see the obvious fit for Brumbaugh. Why go here when he could go to some other programs where he's probably going to have a bigger role right away? Now, he wants to win basketball games. That wasn't happening at Georgetown. That will happen at Gonzaga. That is a compelling point. The other big point, if Gonzaga can convince him, is that the opportunity for him to play a huge role the following year is clearly there. Ryan Nembhard's in his final year of eligibility. Nolan Hickman's in his final year of eligibility. There is a huge gap of playing time after this season is up where he could step right into a starting role. If Gonzaga were to add somebody like Isaiah Harwell in the class of 25, you have a freshman in Harwell starting alongside a junior in Brumbaugh at the point guard position. He already has a year of experience under his belt in this offense. things absolutely just go off for Gonzaga in that situation. But you got to convince Brumbaugh to have a year where he's not playing very much. And that is a tough sell. That is a tough sell. This is why I think this conversation happened. I mean, he mentioned and heard from. I don't think that they're banging down the door trying to get him to come out here right away. I think it's more like, hey, we really like your game. We really like your fit. We think you'd be a great player in this program. This is the situation with where we're at with our guards right now. We'd love to have you be a starter on this program next year. If you want to come here now and play a role and get familiar with the system, we think you could thrive and be an NBA caliber player the following year. I think that's the pitch. I wouldn't blame Brumbaugh for not picking that pitch over some of the other ones that he's going to hear. That makes sense to me that he wouldn't necessarily go for that. But I think that's probably the staff's pitch to Brumbaugh, and I 100% see it. I get it. I understand the vision there, and I would love it if Rowan would understand that vision as well and want to do it. But again, hard to blame him if he finds an opportunity to go to somewhere like Michigan or Ole Miss or Florida State or some of these other programs on here where he's going to get to play much sooner, than he is going to play at Gonzaga. Well, John Calipari, folks, he's out. He is leaving Big Blue Nation and the Kentucky Wildcats. He has taken that head coaching job at Arkansas. What does it mean for Gonzaga's series against Kentucky? What does it mean for who is going to take over as the next coach of the Wildcats? Could it be somebody with some Gonzaga ties? We're going to talk about all of that after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Folks, the sports calendar is loaded right now, and FanDuel is making it even more exciting to get in on the action. Because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet on the tournament. You can use to bet it on MLB, NBA, NHL, and so much more. If you feel like getting a big jump start on next season, Gonzaga is currently plus 3,000 to win the 2025 national championship. If you're already ready to put some money down on that, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a big win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we are talking Coach Cal. When the Gonzaga-Kentucky 6-year series was started, everybody said, there's no way Calipari is still going to be at Kentucky at the conclusion of that series. Calipari made it pretty clear that he had no interest in playing at the McCarthy Athletic Center, scheduling the first games that are in Gonzaga, or in home games for Gonzaga. The first one was at the Spokane Arena. The next one was in Seattle. And then finally, the last game of the series was going to be played at the McCarthy Athletic Center, I think in 2027. Now, I don't think many people thought that Calipari would be out after just the first 2 years of this series, but after failing to have NCAA tournament success, and there just hasn't been NCAA tournament success at Kentucky under Calipari in the last 5 years. You had the St. Peter's loss as a 2 seed to a 15 seed. This year you had as a 3 seed, they lose to Oakland, a 14 seed. Like, we've just seen this team continue to struggle in the NCAA tournament to generate much success. And while he's still getting top recruiting classes, still getting good players in the transfer portal, still churning out elite production in the NBA, he kind of wore out his welcome in Lexington. And instead of getting fired, he ultimately decides to take this job at Arkansas, which is open because Eric Musselman, the Arkansas coach, takes the job at USC, vacated by Andy Enfield, who took the SMU job. SMU fired their coach Rob Joyner a few weeks ago. Nobody thought that move for SMU firing their coach was going to somehow lead to John Calipari leaving Kentucky, but that's what makes the coaching carousel so dang fun. It's reportedly a 5-year deal for Coach Calipari, $33 million buyout for Coach Cal, tons of financial implications here. Tyson Chicken was the big moneymaker at Arkansas. Apparently there's a close connection there with Calipari. They're a huge booster for Arkansas. They wrangled up the money. They made it work. As I'm recording this right now, it hasn't been finalized, but it is basically finalized that this is happening, that this is the deal, that Calipari is ending his tenure as the head coach of the Kentucky Wildcats, a tenure that's led to national championships, but also led to, as we mentioned, a lot of disappointing finishes in the NCAA tournament. And there's a lot of elements to this. Who from Kentucky currently is going to follow Calipari to Arkansas? Who's going to still go to the NBA? Who's going to maybe enter the transfer portal and go elsewhere? We talked about Adu Thiero on a recent episode of Locked On Zags. Could there be other players in the portal, and what could that mean kind of trickling down around college basketball? And then, of course, what does it mean for Kentucky? And I think that's the most interesting part of this, because Kentucky basketball will forever be like the job. It is the college basketball job. It is similar to when Alabama football was open a few months ago when Nick Saban retired. Like, that is the job in college athletics. And that means Kentucky, they're going to shoot for the moon. They're going to try to make the best hire possible. And they are in a position to make whoever they call say no. And I don't want you to think I'm leading this down a direction of Mark Few. That's not happening. We're not even going to entertain that beyond what I just said. Mark Few's not going to Kentucky. He's not leaving Gonzaga. We're fine there. But I think Kentucky could make some potentially like really big calls here. Like, I think they're going to call Danny Hurley. I think they're going to give that a shot. Like, why not? Why not try to call a coach who's had the kind of success that he's had at UConn? For the record, I don't think Danny Hurley's leaving, but you make that call. You call Jay Wright, who's been in the broadcast booth now after being obviously the head coach at Villanova and the amount of success that he had. And I think Jay Wright says no. I think if he wanted to still be coaching college basketball, he'd still be coaching at Villanova, but you make him say no to that. Same with somebody like Billy Donovan, head coach for the Chicago Bulls. He led Florida to the back-to-back national championships in 2006 and 2007. Hasn't been a college coach since 2015, but you give him a call. The Bulls might fire him. You give him a call. Brad Stevens, he hasn't coached in college basketball since 2013 when he was the coach at Butler, but he's been obviously a successful coach in the NBA with the Boston Celtics. He's been in the front office for a while. Maybe he's itching to get back on the sidelines. Give him a call. Make these calls. Call Scott Drew at Baylor. Some people think that's realistic. I'm not sure that Baylor would leave, but if he's going to, that Drew would leave Baylor, but if he's going to leave for any job, it's probably Kentucky. Nate Oats. That's a more realistic one. Maybe we're just going to have a big old SEC coaching carousel thing here where Muss leaves and then Calipari goes to an SEC school in Arkansas. Oats goes from Alabama to Kentucky. Maybe, I don't know, Chris Jans, the Mississippi State coach, will go to Alabama. Like, who knows? We could just get this whole big SEC coaching carousel. But there are a couple other names that are more familiar to Gonzaga fans that I want to toss out here as well. I don't think the timing is right for Kentucky to make a big offer and a big push for Tommy Lloyd. I don't think the timing is right. I think that Kentucky fans who are so frustrated with the lack of NCAA tournament success under John Calipari are probably not going to fully get behind hiring Tommy Lloyd, who has struggled to win games in the NCAA tournament. I think Tommy's going to turn it around. I think he's going to start finding success in the tournament. And I think maybe sometime down the line, if a bigger program wants to offer Tommy a job, that could happen. I don't think the timing is right now for Lloyd to jump to Kentucky. Mark Pope is another name that has been tossed around. I think Kentucky has their sights set a little bit higher, but Mark Pope played at Kentucky. He led BYU to a much more successful season in the first year of the Big 12, than anybody thought he was going to do. They were a 6 seed. They also lost to an 11 seed. Again, not having sustained NCAA tournament success is probably going to be a negative in that hiring there. But Mark Pope would take that job. I think he would leave BYU for Kentucky pretty clearly. But Kentucky's going to keep their eyes set on that Scott Drew, Nate Oats kind of line before they kind of go to that Mark Pope. Before they start looking at coaches like Pope and Lloyd. But what does this mean for Gonzaga's series with Kentucky? And if I had a better answer for you, I'd give it to you, but we just don't know. We don't know. It's hard for me to imagine a new coach would come in and immediately not want this on the docket. And you look at some of the options for who they might be looking at right now. I think if it's Nate Oats, I think if it's Scott Drew, I think if it's improbably Danny Hurley, I think all of them keep it. Because Gonzaga has a history. They've done a home and home or a pseudo home and home with Alabama and Nate Oats when they played in Seattle and they played the other game in Alabama. We've also seen it with Danny Hurley. Obviously, they're in the middle of it right now where they played UConn in Seattle this year. They're going to play them in Madison Square Garden next year. Scott Drew, obviously a strong connection between Drew and Few. I think if he were to go to Kentucky, they would keep that series as well. I'm not sure which coaches would definitively get rid of it. Like, I don't know why, if a coach like Billy Donovan or Jay Wright were to come back into college basketball, I don't think that they're going to wipe the slate clean and rebuild a new schedule. I think they're going to see, okay, we got Gonzaga for the next 4 years. Great. Let's just keep that on there and move from there. Tommy Lloyd's a coach where maybe they take it off. Maybe they decide they don't want to do that. They have been very hesitant to play each other up to this point. I could see that continuing where they say, hey, we're just going to scrap this, just like they did with the Gonzaga and Arizona series when Tommy took that job in the first place. Mark Pope, maybe he would do the same. I don't know. I'm not really feeling like Mark Pope's the likely candidate here, so I don't know. But those are the kind of coaches where it's like, okay, maybe those would scrap this series, but by and large, I don't think this is going to impact Gonzaga's 4 remaining games that they have scheduled against Kentucky over the next 4 years, but it is very obviously something worth watching, in part for the Gonzaga scheduling of it all, but also because Kentucky having a job opening is a huge storyline in college basketball, and it has ripple effects throughout the entire sport. So this is well worth keeping an eye on, and we will, of course, keep you up to date on the Kentucky coaching search here on the Locked On Zags podcast. But I want to talk portal stuff once again. Oumar Ballo out the door at the University of Arizona. We're going to talk about that. Plus, Kaylee Trung played in a women's all-star game for college seniors. We're going to talk about that, how she did, what it means for her going forward. All that coming up right after this. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We are closing out the show today talking about a former Zag, Oumar Ballo, entering the transfer portal after his most recent season at the University of Arizona under coach Tommy Lloyd. Ballo still's got 1 year of eligibility remaining because he redshirted during that first year with Gonzaga. It feels like he's been in college for a long time, and indeed he has, as his first year as a college basketball or his college student was in 2019. He redshirted that first year with Gonzaga, played only 24 games in his redshirt freshman year for the Zags. That was back in 2020, 2021. He had a wrist injury, which limited him at the time. He only played 6.3 minutes per game, 2.5 points. He just wasn't in the rotation. He was on that team that went undefeated, that went all the way to the national championship game before losing to Scott Drew and Baylor. But he was behind Drew Timme. He was behind Corey Kispert, who played a bunch of minutes at the 4. He was behind Anton Watson. And again, with the wrist injury, once he came back from that injury, he just never really carved out any rotation minutes after that. The following year, the Zags were going to land somebody named Chet Holmgren, and Ballo decided to transfer. And he followed Tommy Lloyd, who left after that year to go take that head coaching job at Arizona. And it was totally understandable why you would follow Tommy in that situation. Tommy is who recruited him out of Mali. He was close to him. He'd known him since he was a teenager, or he was a high schooler. Like, this was the connection. And I remember there was a lot of panic that Gonzaga was going to lose a bunch more players with Tommy departing or not be able to recruit internationally. And most of those things are concerns that are kind of by the wayside at this point. But Ballo was the big kind of fish that Gonzaga lost alongside Tommy Lloyd when he left to go take that job at Arizona. And Ballo proved why he felt he wanted more playing time. He wasn't going to play over Chet or Drew necessarily, but he was twice named to the All Pac-12 first team. He was the Pac-12 most improved player in the 22-23 season. And this past year, he averaged 13 points, 10 rebounds, 1.3 blocks, played about 26 minutes per game. He was just under 66% on 2-pointers from the field. That is really good. It was a career high for him. Free throw shooting was his major issue. And this year he was under 50%, 49.5%. But regardless, Ballo established himself as a power 6 starting center. He didn't quite have the offensive impact this year that I think people expected of him. He was better. He averaged 14 points a game the year before last, and then only averaged about 13 points per game this year. So it's a small difference, but he just wasn't quite as impactful for Arizona as I think the expectation had been. And now he enters the portal, and I think that's a little bit surprising. I think, you expected him to stay with Tommy, somebody he was really close with. The expectation is that Tommy's not going anywhere. We talked about, flippantly whether he could be considered for that Kentucky job, but I don't think that he's probably not a super serious candidate right now. A week from now, if Kentucky strikes out on Drew and Oats and all these other options, then yeah, maybe things change and Lloyd's a little bit more looked at. But Ballo's decision to enter the transfer portal doesn't seem to have anything to do with Tommy Lloyd's direct future at Arizona. I think he's just looking for a change of scenery. He's got 1 year of eligibility left. He wants to see what's out there. Maybe he will come back to Arizona. Maybe he's just trying to see what other options might be out there. I want to say this right now, just to kind of just get this out of the way. Gonzaga's not a fit here. They're not a fit. It doesn't make sense. Ballo's not going to transfer somewhere to play less. He wants to play more, or at least the same amount, and he wants to put himself in a position to be an All-American caliber center, to be one of the best bigs in the country, to get some serious attention either as an NBA player, which stylistically he doesn't fit in the modern NBA, or at least get some serious attention before he embarks on a professional career. Going to Gonzaga to play behind Graham Ike makes no sense. And Gonzaga's not going to recruit Oumar Ballo over Graham Ike. It doesn't make sense. there's no fit for Oumar Ballo at Gonzaga. And that's not a knock on Ballo. It's just a fact that it just doesn't work right now with the way the roster is constructed, unless something were to dramatically change on Gonzaga's roster, which really the only thing would be if Graham Ike were to leave. That'd be the only thing. And there is 0.00% indication that that's going to happen. So Ballo's not coming back to Spokane. I'm very curious where he will go. There are some really big name programs that have starting center spots available this upcoming season. North Carolina is losing Armando Bacot, the leading rebounder in program history. Kentucky, I'm not really sure what exactly is going to go on with their Aaron Bradshaw's in the portal. We'll see what happens with Zvonimir Ivisic. Obviously, they need a coach before they do anything else, but that could be a potential spot for him. Colorado lost Eddie Lampkin to the transfer portal. They need some front court help. Maybe they could pursue Ballo. Baylor could use some front court help as well. Boston College lost Quentin Post, their starting center, one of the best kind of unheralded bigs in the entire league. Oregon, N'Faly Dante is out the door. He's graduating. I could see Oregon trying to get Ballo to kind of replace Dante. They're similar stylistic players. So I think that could potentially work there. That's just a few off the top of my head. There are tons of programs that could use a player of Oumar Ballo's caliber and overall talent level. So this will be a very fascinating transfer portal player to watch, but I wouldn't expect there to be any real movement in terms of him coming to Gonzaga because it just doesn't fit with the current roster. Last note here on today's episode of Locked On Zags, I want to talk about Kaylee Trung participating in the Women's College All-Star Game. This game was played on April 6th in Cleveland ahead of the NCAA Tournament Women's Championship, won by Dawn Staley and South Carolina, taking down Caitlin Clark and Iowa in that game. This is the Women's College All-Star Game was started 25 years ago, but only lasted about 6 or 7 years before they scrapped it. They decided to bring it back this year. It's a series of players who are out of eligibility. So there are players who are no longer returning to college. A lot of players who are, hoping to be in the WNBA, like All-American caliber players. I mean, it's an all-star game. It's supposed to be the best of the very best. It was broadcast on ESPN2. Trung was on Team Lieberman, coached by Nancy Lieberman, a Hall of Famer. The other team was coached by Cheryl Miller, Reggie Miller's sister, and also a Hall of Famer in her own right who played at USC. So it was cool to see kind of the stars come out for this game. Team Lieberman, Trung's team won 95-88. In this contest, Trung herself had 8 points, 2 assists, 2 boards in 11 minutes. She was 3 of 5 from the field. That included going 2 of 3 from deep. What an accomplishment for her to cap off her career at Gonzaga by making this all-star game, getting to play with some of the very best of the very best. Trung finished her senior season, her final year of her Gonzaga basketball career, averaging a career-high 12 points, 4.5 assists, as well as 2.5 boards per game. She shot a hair under 40% from 3. She's a little over 82% from the free throw line. Shout out to Kaylee Trung for a fantastic finish to her career, opportunity to play in this all-star game. And shout out the Twins. Just two of the absolute very best to put on a Gonzaga basketball uniform. They're both in the top 5 in Gonzaga basketball school history in assists. That is an incredible accomplishment, a testament to their abilities, a testament to Coach Lisa Fortier's abilities, and the offense that they run in this setting. And just, we're going to miss them. They're going to be hard players to replace. Gonzaga's set up well with Callie Stokes potentially stepping into a bigger role. They got some freshman guards from last year like Claire O'Connor who are going to step into bigger roles. Some incoming freshmen who are going to step into probably bigger roles than Coach Fortier typically gives freshmen, although we're still very early in the offseason, and there are certainly some transfers who will be interested in coming to Gonzaga. So perhaps Coach Fortier will use the portal to supplement some of the losses that they're going to have this year. Not just the Trung twins, but also Brenna Maxwell out of eligibility. I don't think Eliza Hollingsworth is returning. I'm not sure if she's able to return. Perhaps she is. But even with just the Trung twins and Maxwell out the door, that's a lot of scoring, a lot of offensive output to have to replace in the portal or in just using some of those incoming players for Coach Fortier's team next season. But very excited to see how the offseason shakes out for this team, for both teams, quite frankly, and wanted to give a shout out to Trung Kaylee for finishing her career playing in this fun Women's College All-Star Game. Going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back later this week getting you into our season in review series, talking about every player on the roster, how they performed this year, their best and worst case scenarios, and their future, whether it's in Spokane or not. So take a look out for those shows coming your way very soon. Until next time, as always, go Zags.